Hi, I'm Joshua Calloway, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Ford. He's the Research Wildlife Biologist Unit Leader of the Virginia Cooperation Fish and Wildlife Unit in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. And my first question for you would be, how will the chronic waste disease affect the deer population on the east coast of the U.S.?
Well, that actually is a fairly complicated question, and the answer to that is, as we always say, wildlife management, it depends. I guess in the short term, chronic wasting disease is something that folks worry about from not only a deer herd health perspective, but also from a human perspective as well too. We know that there are a lot of deer out there, and there's a declining pool of hunters, and that's just another thing that may cause somebody to say, well, I don't know if deer hunting and the consumption of venison is safe, so maybe I'm not going to do that anymore. I think that's really how it's going to affect the deer herd, primarily in the east. In the near term, deer herd's going to continue to sort of be uncontrolled, perhaps in areas. It is possible that over time, though, it will work on the population. That certainly has happened with deer in Colorado and Wyoming. And so it could happen here in the east, where it occurs in Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, and in other places such as New York and Wisconsin. Particularly, it'll work on the older age structure bucks. If you're interested in quality deer management, and you're interested in getting bucks to past 2.5 years old, chronic wasting disease is the kind of disease that affects older animals. So it may have that effect of taking those quality animals out, or may make quality deer management efforts somewhat futile in the future. How it spreads and how far and where that goes is anybody's bet. So it's just sort of a wait and see. Maybe we'll know the answers in 10 years, maybe 100 years. So, right.
And how do you think humans can be affected by chronic wasting disease?
I think the jury's still out. Most evidence that we have right now is that it probably doesn't affect humans, and that consumption of venison from a deer that had chronic wasting disease is probably okay. But state agencies and public health organizations have guidelines for instance, you shouldn't eat tissues or where the chronic wasting disease is caused by a prion, which is sort of I don't know, it's not really a virus, it's sort of half alive and half inanimate. But things, the brain, I think things around the salivary glands, spinal tissue, you have to take precautions on making sure there's not bone fragments in the meat and things like that. But it's very similar to diseases that livestock can get, like scrapie or mad cow disease, and it's very similar to, I would imagine, or at least the etiology of it's very similar to the Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, which is what humans get, and apparently is a very unpleasant way to pass on to your great reward. So my guess is there's a lot that we still don't know relative to the human health impacts.
My name is Ethan Barker, and I have my first question would be, what was the biggest influence on your career choice to be a wildlife manager?
Well, I probably had several things that influenced me at several times, all at once, or over a period of years. I grew up in East Tennessee, and the county where I live, part of the county was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and another part of the county was in the Cherokee National Forest. And in fact, one of the little farms that we own bordered the Cherokee National Forest, so I was always around conservation folks, conservation agencies, and from early on in life I was sort of fascinated with natural resources, natural resource management, and particularly with wildlife. Then in high school I sort of gravitated toward things in the biological sciences, and it made sense that was my major as an undergraduate at the University of Tennessee. But while I was at Tennessee, fairly early on, there was a research associate, not a professor, mind you, but a fellow named Billy Menzer, whom sort of had his foot. He taught some classes. He mentored graduate students, but he sort of was in that in between world. But he took a strong interest in working with undergraduates and trying to develop those that had an interest in that and keeping them going on the right path. Take this class if you want to go to graduate school. Here are the graduate when you were a senior. Here are the graduate schools that I think you ought to apply. And he sort of, I would say he was a pretty big influence in keeping me in this profession.
What interested you in to study flying squirrels?
One of my first positions when I got out of graduate school was I was a wildlife biologist for a private timber company, and we had at that time we managed about over 500,000 or 600,000 acres in Virginia and West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and we cooperatively managed probably another 1 million acres of private lands. And on some of those lands was an endangered flying squirrel, the Virginia northern flying squirrel, which is tied to high elevation red spruce forest. So I sort of became aware of the flying squirrel as part of my duties as a wildlife biologist from a regulatory standpoint. And the more I learned how to manage for the squirrel, or in some cases manage around the squirrel, so that the company didn't violate the Endangered Species Act, I sort of became quite interested and enamored with their habits and the habitat that they use and their ecology.
My name is Mark Foster, and what are some ways students can get involved in your research, in your research including like bats and deer and forestry?
I think one of the first things that students should do is certainly they should go to every faculty member's website and see what their research program is all about, and so they sort of get a sense of who does what here at Virginia Tech. In my case, I encourage students, graduate or undergraduate, certainly come to my office, and if I've got time to talk about what I do and what projects I have going on, I'll certainly do that. But probably the best thing that an undergraduate can do is to certainly go to the Chapter of Wildlife Society meetings at Virginia Tech, and whenever they get a chance to go to a thesis or dissertation seminar, presentation, or defense, or anything where the graduate students are involved, where they discuss their research, that's the thing to do. So that makes you more aware of what's going on. And as those graduate students ultimately are the ones that are going to be looking for summer help on the bat projects. For instance, the bat projects that I have at Fort Drum, Fort Knox, on military installations, or the flying squirrel work that I do in North Carolina and West Virginia. Those are the folks that need those hands in the field. So that's the absolute best advice I can give.
What has been your greatest achievement, in your opinion, this far in your career?
I think I have two achievements. I don't know how notable they are. First, early on, in the early 90s, I was involved with some prescribed fire research in the southern Appalachians, looking at the impact of fire on non-game taxa like salamanders and small mammals. And the thinking was that we needed to return fire to not only southern but also central Appalachian ecosystems to sort of restore the proper disturbance regimes and get the communities back in balance where they need to be, kill some of the shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive species that shaded out oaks and some of the montane pines and things like that. There was a big concern then, that was 20 years ago, a big concern that we may need fire, but the impact to the other critters would be such that it wouldn't be worthwhile. So for these past 2 decades, I've been involved in that kind of work, and I think some of the work we did early on and then carried through sort of helped folks turn the corner, and there's pretty broad consensus among the wildlife community, whether they're game or non-game, that fire has a role in Appalachian landscapes. The other achievement that I'm fairly proud of, that sort of links back to the squirrel, is this notion of rather than just walking away from relic habitats like the high elevation red spruce communities in the Appalachians, that maybe we can actively manage them and we can do things to promote their restoration and even do things sort of to increase their extent on the landscape through employment of silvicultural practices. And early on, I could think about taking those ideas out to natural resource managers, particularly in Virginia and West Virginia, and folks kind of scoffing at it and laughing at it. But we just I and other folks we just kept hammering on it until folks finally woke up and thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. And from a biodiversity standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint, and even from things that the public will support. So I think we've turned the corner, and folks actually use the words spruce restoration in something. They use it in open company now. They don't use it in hushed tones.
All right, I'm Lucas Sachs, and my first question is, have you done any research on fisheries, and if so, what have you done?
Well, even though I'm a research wildlife biologist and most of my career has been spent on the terrestrial upland side of things, I have done a little bit of fisheries work. For my master's project at Mississippi State, I looked at organochlorine contaminants in aquatic systems in the Mississippi alluvial valley, an area known as the Delta of Mississippi. And so I worked with a lot of rough fish species, big mouth buffalo, smallmouth buffalo, several species of gar, carp, and a little bitty forage fish called gambusia, or the mosquito fish. So I have a little bit of experience going out there and shocking fish up and running fish into gill nets and doing quite a bit of seine hauls and things like that. Sure.
What is your favorite part of your work and research that you've done?
I think my favorite part has always been the challenge to answer questions that nobody's either posed or provided an answer to, and figuring out, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and figuring out what's the most efficacious and parsimonious way to do that. The other thing that I've enjoyed is I've had the ability to keep working on research projects over the long term. So invest many years and revisit plots and follow a radio tagged animal for a long time and develop a long-term data sets and everything. That's a lot of folks don't have the opportunity to do that, and that's been quite rewarding to do that over time.
Thanks for your time. It's been really interesting hearing about all your research.
Well, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.